So welcome, Karen.
Okay, I want to say before we start, credit goes to those in the room. For many, climate change is too much, too soon, and too little we can do. Given what we know about climate change, most people carry strong images of what is likely to happen if we don't take radical action now. I want to invite you to call up an image of some change you think might happen before today's teens retire. Few outside science are alarmed. I hear all of this. It's not going to happen to me. I heard Europeans say the weakening Gulf Stream will cool Europe, or climate change will only harm the Arctic or Africa. Not true. Climate change will happen in the future to someone else, my poor kids, grandkids, great-great-grandkids. Not true. Climate change is easy to address. We can do it with renewables. Not true. I'm in the transition movement or otherwise found ways to protect myself. Not true. I hear these kinds of statements often, even from the young. Does anyone here, show of hands, recognize any of these feelings? Yes, it's pretty normal. Their responses are natural. Even scientists are not above some wishful thinking. But the job puts them face to face with some hard facts that should survive challenge over time. So let's look at what they have seen happening. This is a review for some of you, and this does not include 2015 on the graph. Carbon dioxide has risen 40% from pre-industrial times to 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. Temperatures are generally rising as the carbon dioxide increases, although there are volcanoes and weather, but the trend is up. The temperature today is already 1.1 degrees C or more, 2 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial. Such a rapid change has not happened in human history, and it's getting faster. We've seen dramatic changes already. We've seen increases in floods, droughts, ocean dead zones attributed to climate change, extreme precipitation and temperatures, especially high. We've seen decrease in snowpack and agricultural yield compared to business as usual. A number of species are already at risk from global warming, such as birds and polar bears. World Health Organization said that in 2000, more than 150,000 died from climate change, from heat waves, flooding, drought, and disease. This is before the big heat waves started in Eurasia that killed so many tens of thousands in 1 year. And the numbers are going up. Trying to keep temperature increase under 2 degrees C was a goal set a few years ago when it was thought the worst effects can be avoided. Now many scientists would rather stay under 1.5 degrees C. We are on track to reach 2 degrees C when today's teens are in their 40s. That's even with the commitments at Paris. By that time, Brazil wheat will be down 50%, soybean down 70%. Rice will be down in many places around the world. The goal of keeping temperature increase below 2 degrees C by 2100 is technically possible, although challenging. As early as mid-century, water runoff could decrease significantly around the Mediterranean, southern Africa, and large areas of South America. Dust bowls are on their way. This shows two different scenarios for the end of the century, and we really get our act together. One on the left still shows massive drought in North America. That's probably what North America will look like, or worse, by mid-century on our current path. Increased drought will come with increased rain and floods in parts of the U.S. and the world, but the ground will be drier because of the heat. Climate departure is the year after which the climate where you live departs forever from the norm. The norm is 1880 to 2005, is the years for which we have pretty good data. And Mexico City, well, this is not being compared to pre-industrial. Mexico City is expected to reach climate departure in the early 2030s. Locally, this is expected in the 2040s. We'll have to adapt, and the adaptation will be hard. I didn't bring it because it was a little bit hard to read, but they have pictures of what different parts of the U.S. will look like in 2080s to 2100, different parts of the world. And you see Iowa in the summertime looks like Louisiana. We expect a 4-degree increase from, sometime between when today's teens are in their 70s to early next century. People think 4 degrees C, 7 degrees Fahrenheit, well, it's just a little bit warmer year-round. But scientists are predicting an entirely different climate regime. The difference in temperature between an ice age and the period between an ice age, the interglacials, is only 4 to 6 degrees. That much temperature change means we have dramatically different climates. The difference between our present climate and the ice being more than a mile thick over the northern part of our country. 4-degree increase from pre-industrial is expected to have equally dramatic effects, making large parts of the world uninhabitable as some areas become too hot or dry or are lost due to sea level rise. There will be mass migration. We'll lose people because we're expected to move into mega droughts mid-century, droughts that last decades. And along with this increased need to migrate, we will be migrating faster than when we moved between glacials and ice age and interglacials in the past. Then we only had our arrowheads to carry. Now we have fixed houses, we have infrastructure, and government collapse in many places is expected. So I invite you to take a minute to focus on an image. Consider what you will see in your lifetime or what teens will see in theirs. And pay a little bit of attention to where you feel it. Because people skip over the paying attention part. To reduce the possibility of that image coming to pass, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Where we disagree is how best to reduce them. So this gives an idea how fast the curve has to shift, especially electricity. You see the reference scenario, huge increase in energy use as population goes up 30% by mid-century. Many who live without acquire light bulbs, cars, air conditioners. A goal of 2 degrees C, again, is not going to be fast enough, but it is going to be plenty fast, very difficult. And then we're going to need to zero out greenhouse gas emissions after this time, after mid-century. And then we're going to need to take carbon dioxide out of the air. We can keep temperature increase below 2 degrees, but only if climate change is a priority. So the goal is to reduce by mid-century per capita greenhouse gas emissions worldwide to less than 10% of our current per capita emissions. That's more than 90% reduction for us, less for other people. There are a lot of sectors needing reductions. This talk will focus on electricity. Some say, let's do it with efficiency, like more efficient cars, refrigerators, power plants, and conservation, which adds voluntary changes in behavior. Efficiency is the single largest solution in every major report. Voluntary reduction, not so much. Due to confusion among 7 billion about what will work, and motivation is a problem, both for wealthy people who don't want to change our lifestyle, and the poor who are determined to change. Others want to do it with renewables. The public, environmentalists, Obama, and renewables are increasingly important, but all renewables are not enough. We can't zero out greenhouse gas emissions from electricity by mid-century without the heavy guns of nuclear power and carbon capture and storage. I encourage you to invite a speaker on carbon capture and storage, but I'll focus on nuclear, why it's essential, and why so many still resist it. As soon as Obama was elected, before he took office, 10 directors of national labs, including later Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu, posted A Sustainable Energy Future, the Central Role of Nuclear Energy on change.gov. It began, The directors of the Department of Energy National Laboratory strongly believe that nuclear energy must play a significant and growing role in our nation's and the world's energy portfolio. They are not connected to the nuclear industry, but responsible to this country to communicate the best understanding of scientists. On a hopeful note, France has shown it's possible to cut fossil fuel use a lot while quadrupling electricity. France added low greenhouse gas electricity much faster and much more cheaply than Germany is today. The next 2 pages are also a quick look at how fast per capita greenhouse gas emissions can fall. This one is on percentage decrease per year in different places, and only wallfall in Germany exceeded the rate of nuclear. And how fast per capita electricity use was decarbonized. Starting with Sweden. Germany decarbonized faster with nuclear, that isn't on this particular graph, than it is faster with nuclear than it's doing with wind and solar. This is not to say we don't need wind and solar, we do. I've just cited knowledgeable people saying we need nuclear, but there's resistance. Many on the left particularly devote much of their climate change discussion to opposing nuclear power, not to climate change. In California, new nuclear power is illegal until the waste problem is solved. We don't have restrictions on the much larger problem of fossil fuel waste. Many environmental groups base fundraising on opposition to nuclear power. There are strong vocal contingencies in a number of countries. Opposition to nuclear power has been tenacious. Why? I invite you to picture your greatest concern about expanding nuclear power in the West. And if you don't have one, channel your neighbors. And during the talk, hold these 2 concerns: climate change, the image you had, or expanding US nuclear power as rapidly as possible. Consider which is the greater risk. In all the time I've been doing presentations, there is no single concern I've heard from a majority of those who oppose nuclear. Let's look at some of the concerns I've heard most often. I'm using Yucca Mountain as an example of a nuclear waste repository. Obama withdrew it from because of political controversies, but that's where US analysis has been done. There's no disagreements among scientists about the relative safety of nuclear waste. For the first 10,000 years, there's essentially no exposure to anybody anywhere. That increases over the next 1 to 500,000 years until the most exposed group, a small group, gets a dose less than if they moved to Denver. Officially, there's no safe level of radioactivity, but when do we really start to worry? While coal is only a few parts per million radioactive atoms, so much more fuel is required that overall for each kilowatt hour of electricity, coal actually exposes us to 4 times as much radioactivity as nuclear does if you count nuclear from mining to decay. Since I began reading in 1995, every major report has said the problems are political, not technical. It turns out that choosing to site the repository on federal land where no one has ever lived was not a good plan. Everyone has learned from the US experience that it's better to ask communities to apply, which is what other countries are now doing, and the Blue Ribbon Commission suggests for the US. Sweden and Finland did that. Finland plans to open its repository in 6 to 8 years. Sweden later. To give you some idea how nuclear waste compares, if counting all of our emissions, it's each person, each day, it's the same as burning 1 40-pound bag of coal. That's 150 pounds of carbon dioxide per capita, per day. The typical American getting all electricity in the home from coal will produce over 20 pounds of carbon dioxide per day. If you get all your electricity from nuclear, you will use 1 Coke can of fuel in your lifetime, and you will produce 1 Coke can of waste. Proliferation and terrorism are the biggest concern of nuclear power. but nuclear power is not among the biggest concerns for proliferation. To address proliferation, get rid of bombs and bomb material all over the world, and strengthen and better fund International Atomic Energy Agency, official monitor for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Although nuclear power isn't important to proliferation, its relation is more than zero. So the designs of US academics in particular, Gen 4, shorthand for fourth generation nuclear plants on the drawing board, will include improvements. For example, it is technically possible to make a bomb using plutonium from stolen reprocessed fuel. It is hard to do. It will be a crummy bomb, but it's possible. Gen 4 won't let you do that. And Gen 4 reactors will deliver enriched uranium as part of the plant, so there's no incentive to enrich fuel. We've discussed waste and proliferation. Another concern is safety. When people ask if nuclear power is safe, they mean, can we guarantee there will never be an accident that results in death? In actual practice, even with early reactors and an early regulatory system, outside the former Soviet Union in Fukushima, there was one reprocessing accident in Japan where 2 people died. No one died or will eventually die from 3 Mile Island. Safety was not enough of a concern before 3 Mile Island, and industry paid heavily for not working more on the issue earlier. It cost them a fortune to retrofit. On the other hand, Chernobyl was a tragedy, and it stays in people's minds. It was a badly designed military reactor, badly redesigned as a commercial reactor. There was no containment system, and the radioactivity wasn't contained. 50 to 60 are already dead, and up to 4,000 may die over the next 5 decades from that immediate exposure. Fukushima was not Chernobyl, and I'm about to tell you why. First of all, from your memory, how dangerous did you think Fukushima might be when you first heard about it? And how dangerous do you think it is now? And did you notice that those numbers went down? Japan faced the worst earthquake and tsunami in more than 1,000 years. Hydrogen explosions, seawater, and pressure exceeding design limits for days. It was extremely expensive, relocating tens of thousands of people, dealing with the accident. For Japan, the largest expense is replacing nuclear with fossil fuels. Dangerous? Even with a nightmare scenario, roads broken so transportation was difficult. 2 types of electricity so equipment transfer was more difficult. The model predicts that 1 worker will die over the next 7 decades, and no one in the public will die from radioactivity. Many will die from the dislocation, psychological stress, and changed behaviors that accompany stress. For example, parents aren't letting their kids play outside because of exaggerated fears about radioactivity, and a lot of those kids will end up with diabetes. A lot of people move to Tokyo, which is more polluted than Los Angeles. Some of the people who lost their jobs were farmers because of exaggerated concern about radioactivity in food. Japan's standards were that the radioactivity could only be 5 to 10% of international standards for radioactivity. Some of the food would not have met international standards, but a lot of the food that was not distributed just wasn't that radioactive. Keep in mind that if Fukushima had been a fossil fuel plant of the same size, more workers and more members of the public would have died each year just from the normally operating plant. Fukushima was also caused by human errors and political mistakes. Just as after 3 Mile Island, there is lots to learn. There are a lot of technical details. We might want to space reactors differently. We might want to put spent fuel in different locations, even though spent fuel turned out not to be a problem. Certainly more backup and types of backup. The US method, which is to figure out what is the maximum land acceleration, for example, in a certain area, might be better in many instances than the Japanese method of looking at recent history. A culture of safety is crucial. 3 Mile Island occurred early in nuclear history and changed how everyone but the Soviet Union looked at safety. We will not be able to prevent nuclear power accidents, but things have continued to improve since 3 Mile Island. Nuclear Regulatory Commission required safety, and the industry became profitable. As a percentage of time the plants operated went from 56% in 1980 to 66% in 1990 to more than 90% today. Example of the safety culture, there was an earthquake in Virginia that exceeded design parameters, and NRC spent 2 months going over the plant there, even though there was never any evidence of damage. Fukushima, like current US reactors, was generation 2. After 3 Mile Island, designers learned to depend less on valves opening and closing and more on physical laws of the universe. So Fukushima couldn't have happened with this reactor. And there's 4 of these now being built in the United States. In the first 3 days, it would depend on gravity, convection, condensation to do the cooling. Their safety systems are more redundant and further apart. Gen 4 is on the drawing boards. There are designs where the core cannot melt. There are new safeguards against proliferation. We've looked at waste, proliferation, and safety. Here's another popular one, that any amount of radioactivity from nuclear power does harm. Here's a movie image from then, showing one imagined result of too much radioactivity: giant mutant insects. These non-rational images are powerful. What people don't realize is that we are bathed in natural radioactivity. We have an average of 3 millisievert per year as background, but around the world this can be as high as 250 millisievert where people live. To date, no radiation-related health effects have been found from those natural sources at those levels, according to the United Nations. Living near a nuclear power plant adds a tiny nit. The most exposed person from Yucca Mountain, 100 to 500,000 years from now, is going to get another 2.6 millisievert. Compare that to Denver, which is in the 12 to 14 millisievert range. Denver is not the most radioactive city in the United States, but it's the most radioactive large city, population 5 million. It also has the lowest cancer rate of any large city in the United States. And from Fukushima, no one in the public had an exposure as high as if they had moved to Denver. Nuclear, wind, and solar serve very different needs. They're discussed as being in competition with each other by the public, but they don't satisfy the same niche. Nuclear supplies baseload 24/7, and it's not as good currently at ramping up when the air conditioners come on. You also get fossil fuels, geothermal, supplying baseload. Wind's niche is if you have fossil fuel baseload. Then, when the wind blows, you can ramp down the fossil fuel. Solar is more expensive and will be for years, but it can play a role when electricity use rises during the day. Not a perfect match, but it helps. By the way, does anyone know what IPCC says will be the most important renewable in the mid-century time frame? Just yell it out. Bioenergy. I won't be talking about biomass here, except to say that IPCC says the amounts needed can't be grown sustainably. They explain we must do it anyway, despite the damage to Earth's ecosystems, converting them to grow our energy. Today, hydroelectric definitely dominates. I think something like, out of 25% renewable electricity, 22% is from hydro. Those are big emotional concerns. Another concern is financial, and this is real. Fossil fuels are highly subsidized. Fossil fuel pollution has a cost paid by the entire society, not just the polluter. The polluter being the person who uses electricity, who chooses the fossil fuel power plant, who rides in the airplane. That cost can be estimated. If the polluter doesn't pay, society bears the cost, so it's a de facto subsidy. Economists draw the obvious concern to recover damages, a conclusion to recover damages, promote clean energy sources, and prompt behavior change at a cost, so polluters pay. Conservative economists, liberal economists, in-between economists, they all agree. Failing to charge polluters is de facto subsidy. So to give you an idea of the size of fossil fuels, there's the direct subsidies, the ones that are usually discussed. There's $100 billion worldwide in production subsidies in the fossil fuel producing countries. There's $400 billion in user subsidies in the developing world. So for example, Venezuela charges 25 cents for a gallon of gasoline. With the price of energy down so much, this number is probably down a lot. And then there are the externalities, the indirect subsidies, the de facto, the costs we make invisible. Air pollution, or smog, is more than $1 trillion a year spent on damage to health, agriculture, lost wages, and so on. Greenhouse gas pollution is $1.4 trillion a year just for the effect of carbon dioxide on health, agriculture, infrastructure adaptation, and responses to drought, flood, and sea level rise. Other causes of climate change add hundreds of billions of dollars to this number. Climate change and pollution already cost us. We're already paying these costs. And then there's intangible costs, like people losing fishing spots or sports they love or places they love. So what kind of price are we talking about? The current US estimate of the social cost of greenhouse gas, based on predictions of damage only in the near future, economists don't go out very far, is $41 a ton carbon dioxide equivalent. That adds about 4 cents a kilowatt hour to coal, half that to natural gas, and 38 cents a gallon to gasoline. Prominent economists, including at least one Nobel Prize winner, argue that that number should be higher because of the number, they give a number of reasons. And International Energy Agency and other organizations and individuals like Jim Hansen are estimating costs that pass hundreds of dollars a ton, pass $100 a ton in the next decade or two. And Jim Hansen is saying that we will spend later this century hundreds of dollars a ton to take carbon dioxide out of the air. Nuclear is cheaper than or competitive with coal, even in coal countries. Natural gas is much more expensive than coal in most countries. Low prices of US natural gas due to fracking encourages the US to shift from coal to natural gas, so that's a plus. On the other hand, it also encourages us to shift from nuclear. So this bridge fuel of natural gas, and we're building a lot of natural gas in California. 60% of our in-state electricity, and you can figure most of our out-of-state electricity is natural gas. Any plants we build today will operate for decades. And again, we may spend hundreds of dollars a ton later this century to take that out of the air. We don't want nuclear everywhere. It's important to have a strong regulatory structure and a willingness to cooperate with the United Nations. We will probably keep hearing opposition to nuclear power. And it's a complex and difficult subject with much conflicting information, so it can be tempting to stay away from the controversy. Let's discuss why not to do that. First, you've got your image of climate change. Will require everything we can throw at it, and it's foolhardy to throw away one of the most powerful solutions. Nuclear, wind, and solar are all low greenhouse gas. Wind and solar, in practice, use natural gas backup, so you have to add another 125 grams or more per kilowatt hour because you're using inefficient natural gas. But still, that's less than natural gas would be by itself. So we need nuclear, wind, and solar to reduce our use of fossil fuels. And there are additional advantages of nuclear. After the oil crisis in the 70s, France added 56 reactors in 15 years to save money and reduce pollution, and they accomplished both. France earns €3 billion a year, $4 billion a year from selling nuclear power to other countries in Europe. China sees several 100,000 people dying from coal each year. The United States sees more than 10,000 deaths from coal each year. So we've got all these advantages, including it's essential for climate change, and people in science and policy feel popular concerns are greatly exaggerated. Why is the public discussion so polarized? Why don't all these advantages of nuclear power move public opinion more? As a person trained in science, I thought facts could easily change my mind. But like most other people, I can be very resistant to discovering I have been wrong. Social scientists see the public discussion of nuclear and climate change as polarized for similar reasons. They're minefields even when we talk about global warming. Understate the challenges facing humans, and the public yawns and addresses more important issues. Clarify the challenges, and the public is paralyzed. Bottom line, when confronted with a dreadful situation, we don't manage the situation. We manage the dread by ignoring climate change. Or what about discussing solutions? We're told yes, because otherwise people will leave feeling not empowered to act. And economists find that people are more likely to insulate, which saves money, and buy light bulbs in cars that save money, if they're thinking about how they live. The money isn't enough motivator. We're told no. Social scientists find that people who feel responsible for global warming, either the problem or the solution, go find another political interest. People really want easy tasks, whether they work or not, that excuse behaviors they feel guilty about, often flying. It's moral licensing. Studies show that people who buy a green product feel they have done their bit morally and feel more free to ignore the moral choice the next time. When I started reading in 1995, I learned my own assumptions about nuclear power were wrong. Also, there is little overlap between public and science discussions, and between environmentalist and science discussions. I really did not enjoy being wrong. So I talked about nuclear so that others could be less wrong as well. Perhaps 1/4 of my audience appreciated learning they were wrong and corrected their understanding. These people were caring people. They cared passionately, and they couldn't get unstuck. I really wanted to know why. So I began to ask, why is it so hard to give up favorite problems and favorite solutions? Why do the facts not matter? What is the source of public resistance and indifference? Okay, this is coming out funny, and I will tell you what you're missing. Answers came from social scientists. One interesting field works from a cultural theory of risk, and it says that we look at issues through a distorted lens, and we use that misunderstanding to establish that we are good, thoughtful, moral, loving people, and they are not. There's an evolutionary base of, I'm going to go back and forward and see if it doesn't make any difference. Okay, we reason more often to show that we are trustworthy to our group than to solve the ostensible problem on the table. And social scientists say that, oddly, those in the public who study issues become more polarized. Typically, we react from the gut, often in less than 1 second. On highly complex issues, we don't begin to have the background for. Then we use our intelligence to establish that we were right all along. It is unusual to use our minds to move into a state of tension where we might be wrong, where there is nuance. Most people in groups would rather continue to be wrong than admit to having been wrong. Insular groups attack members who question group expertise. I don't know anyone working at a nuclear power plant, but I know lots of people who travel a lot, use energy and products in the home. It's hard to attack this problem when I and my friends are major users. I discovered these critical thinking errors when I started reading both sides in 1995. There's a failure, and we can avoid making many of these mistakes. There's failure to make direct comparisons. So we'll focus exclusively on the dangers of nuclear waste than what the scientists do, comparing the dangers of waste from different technologies. We do question substitution. How long does nuclear waste last becomes more important than does anyone die? And there's a halo effect. If I like, dislike something or someone, I like, dislike all aspects. If I want renewables, then I insist renewables are safe, sufficient, and cheap, or will be by a week from Tuesday. Single action bias. Individuals responding to a threat are likely to rely on one action, even when it provides only incremental protection or risk reduction, and may not be the most effective option. People often take no further action, presumably because the first one succeeded in reducing their feeling of worry or vulnerability. Again, we manage our feelings, not the problem. Notice, when is the last time you or others made a basic behavior change or change in policies you advocate in response to concern about climate change? How long after that did you keep asking, what else can I do? It's sometimes hard to figure out what the facts are when it's not even clear whether scientists agree. The media balanced spokespeople for the science community with someone with an opposing position, no matter how few agree with them or how odd the idea. They call this a fairness doctrine for covering political controversy. Only the public thinks it's scientific controversy. We don't typically seek sources of information that regularly show errors in our thinking. Just ask yourself which information sources you rely on. When was the last time you were really surprised on a significant issue by what you learned? Science has a good process for that. Scientists improve accuracy of information they rely on through more experiments, multiple lines of evidence, many lines of review. And this part I love. Ideas that are no longer accepted die, unless there is reason to revisit them. Scientific discussion begins with peer review. That's necessary, but definitely not sufficient. It goes to higher levels of peer review, like through government agencies, NOAA, NASA, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then to higher levels of review, National Academy of Sciences, and so on. Their mistakes are addressed in journals like Science. This doesn't mean that scientists are always right. Human knowledge is limited, but they sure do better than those who don't go through the process. I rely on information from higher levels of peer review, and I'll give some sources at the end. Governments can confuse the issue. This is a picture of people who were required to wear hazmat outfits after Fukushima to visit their homes. No children were allowed. They could only visit their houses for up to 2 hours. Their houses were 15% as radioactive as if they had been in an airplane. The US regulates only radioactivity from nuclear power because it is too expensive to regulate it from coal power, and too far down coal's list of sins. Even environmentalists add to the problem. Sierra Club runs against Republicans, so Republicans now run against the environment. Positions are chosen based on fundraising rather than asking scientists and policy experts. It's hard to change positions on issues. Oops, we've just decided that nuclear power and GMOs are safe and necessary, just as scientists have been saying all along. Jim Hansen quit his job at NASA because he didn't think the public was concerned enough about climate change. He focused on overcoming denial, and in the last couple of years, he's also targeting environmental groups that oppose nuclear, another type of denial. Hansen says stop donating monies to groups that oppose nuclear if you're serious about climate change. You may have heard of some of these people getting credit for warning the sky is falling and making money on the alarmist lecture circuit. And New York Times and other newspapers seriously overvalue the credentials of alarmists like this by reporting them as some scientists said. A lot of these people are not scientists. In fact, I don't think any of them are. Gunderson and Alvarez in 2011 said spent fuel pool 4 had caught fire. In 2012, more than 1 year after the accident, they said it could still catch fire and result in widespread dispersal. No, that could only go for a few weeks. In 2013, the upcoming Japanese removal of fuel rods, which is now complete, could produce an apocalypse. Mangano and Sherman reported 14,000 US deaths, mostly babies, after Fukushima, in the few weeks after Fukushima in the United States. If there were 14,000 deaths in the United States, how is it possible that anyone is walking around Japan today? And then we've been hearing the radioactivity is coming to shores near us for years. It adds an infinitesimal amount to ocean water. Ask yourself who benefits by keeping the public discussion a mess. In a way, we all do, because we can simply attack other groups for not agreeing with us without doing the hard work of challenging our own thinking. With all these difficulties in knowing who to believe and wanting to avoid going out on a limb and riling our friends, how can we seriously address the problems of climate change and work to include very important but less popular solutions like nuclear power? The first step is awful, a willingness to go through the process ourselves. We can accept feeling unsure and often mistaken. It's in a good cause, solving real problems. We can stick with it. Giving up because I feel confused leaves the problem unaddressed. We can examine underlying assumptions in the discussion. Many attack UN science organizations, IPCC, IAEA, WHO, the organizations we depend on for our knowledge. We can take risks. There's no risk reaching out to someone who won't listen. Risk is reaching out to people in my group who expect me to agree with them. We can frame our thinking in other than we versus they. This helps reduce polarization and sets up a willingness to converse rather than lecture, because no side comes close to solving climate change. And we can't mount a concerted effort while we're enemies fighting over who is right and who is wrong. We can move climate change onto the to-do list, although it is hard to dislodge big issues with another big issues. We can influence policy, particularly adding a steep cost on greenhouse gas emissions through cap and trade or top. And we question those who work against the expansion of new nuclear. Recall your images of nuclear power worst case and your image of climate change within 5 decades. Is there any danger in use of nuclear power that could possibly be greater than the dangers of not ramping up as fast as possible? We can keep temperature increase below 2 if we move toward all solutions as fast as possible. We can reduce polarization if we let others know that we are changing our minds and why. Journalism goes for narratives of baddies and goodies. We're encouraged to set up oppositions, and we seem programmed to like this. Keeps things dramatic, winners and losers. Yet success won't come from enemy narratives of we versus they, but from a social movement based on narratives of cooperation, mutual interests, our common humanity. Thanks for anything and everything you are doing, for what you will do tomorrow and the next day. Questions? And somebody had a question already about thorium. If I'm not able to answer questions, both Lynn and Jim have my email, and you can contact me.
Where's the mic?
The mic?
Oh, there. Okay.
Okay, everyone put up your hands, and I'll try to go around the room, so just keep reminding me to put up your hands.
If memory serves, 4 out of the 5 nuclear power plants in California are shuttered. Can you give us a little overview of why they are no longer operating and what the future holds for them and for how long?
There are 2 power plants were closed in San Onofre. What happened was a miss. Southern California Edison, working with Mitsubishi, I think it was, they messed up. I don't know who messed up more on some repair work. The repair work was not a safety issue, it was an economic issue. So San Onofre could have continued to operate at lower power for some time. But due to political pressure, they brought in NRC. NRC refused to give them a timetable. So NRC messed up. And Southern California Edison just washed its hands of the whole project, and because without a guarantee of this is going to be over in like 90 years or something, it didn't make sense for them to keep it. The capital costs of nuclear plants are expensive. It didn't make sense for them to continue. It also shows that our costs added to greenhouse gas are added downstream. If they were added upstream, then the natural gas, Southern California Edison would be penalized for adding for building natural gas, which is what they've had to do. They've had to build natural gas to replace SOMs. There is a controversy about Diablo Canyon, and that is because of the fish eggs. Anything that's built on the coast brings in water, heats it up, spits it out, and some of the water that Diablo Canyon brings in ends up killing a bunch of fish eggs. Well, fish eggs are getting killed all the time. This is a relatively small fish egg kill, but the state wants PG&E to build very expensive cooling towers instead of using this ocean water. It says to me that the state has missed the part about mega droughts, likely mid-century. I mean, fish eggs are important, but you don't build natural gas in lieu of nuclear power if you're worried about life, if you're worried about fish, if you're worried about any other species.
Hi there. First, I want to say thank you. I appreciated the review of cognitive biases, a favorite topic of mine. But I did want to get back to the nuke thing. So one of the things I missed in the talk was a comparison between the costs for kilowatt hours of energy between solar, wind, and nuclear. And then the second part of the question is, there's a subsidy that's kind of invisible to nuclear, which is that the taxpayer's on the hook for any potential damages or liabilities should there be a problem with the nuclear power plant. And if I understand correctly, the private insurance industry will not insure nuclear power because of potentially catastrophic costs.
Okay, so to answer the first question, solar is more expensive than nuclear. It will be for years. However, if you look at Energy Information Agency from the DOE, they do not compare the costs because you can't compare intermittent costs, non-dispatchable costs, with dispatchable energy like nuclear power. And they serve different niches. So nuclear at this point cannot serve the same niche solar does, but solar is and will be for many years much more expensive than nuclear. Price-Anderson, I believe, is what you're referring to. This is popularly called a subsidy, except for it's not. The Price-Anderson requires, I forget the number now, something like, it's the maximum insurance you can get on your nuclear power plant, whatever that number is. And then after you get the maximum insurance, every nuclear power plant in the US is responsible, every nuclear reactor. So if you have several nuclear reactors at your nuclear plant, each reactor is responsible if somebody has an accident that goes over their insurance costs. And everybody has to chip in some incredibly large sum of money in case there's an accident anywhere. Suppose the cost of this accident goes over both the cost of the insurance and what is being chipped in by the 100 reactors in the United States. the US government has two possibilities. One is they can retroactively increase the amount that the nuclear industry pays. Or if it's something like Fukushima caused by a tsunami in a place you wouldn't expect a tsunami, then they can, the government can decide to chip in. In the history, over 50 years, I'm not sure how long Price Anderson has been around, but it was around before 3 Mile Island. The U.S. has never given any money to this so-called subsidy. And it's, in the public perception, it's a subsidy. And it's so effective that they wanted to use this for carbon capture and storage. But because environmentalists have termed this a subsidy, this very effective pricing mechanism for penalizing any problems with carbon capture and storage has to be crossed off the list.
Hello. I would have to say that in theory I'm with you on the idea of nuclear. But the thing is, the nuclear plants are very big, very expensive. They require giant corporations with hundreds and thousands of employees. They have to navigate a lot of government regulation, which requires a lot of lobbyists. And as we've seen, for example, with the Volkswagen diesel debacle, corporations aren't always the best stewards of the environment. How do you mitigate those kind of concerns?
Before there was Volkswagen, in Los Angeles, you had something like 1/3 of people disconnecting their smog control back when it was possible, even though they could see the results of their actions. So it's not that individuals, there's not a lot of evidence to say that individuals somehow are magically pure and corporations are bad. However, in the United States, we do not depend on the corporations themselves to be good. We depend on regulatory agencies like Nuclear Regulatory Commission to monitor them. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission watches nuclear a lot more carefully than EPA watches the people they're watching. When I was taking classes at Cal, Berkeley, we visited a bunch of power plants, and we visited an oil refinery, and they have a lot of problems with fires in the oil refineries in Richmond. And they were just allowed to self-monitor. You know, they let EPA know when they have a problem. NRC is not that generous to the power plants, to the people, to the agents, the power plants it monitors.
Yeah, I had about 5 things, but I'll try to narrow it down. As he mentioned, the regulatory environment for nuclear technology is just horrendous. Even if there's so much regulation, it's over-regulated, and it's a solution on the shelf that could be, put forward to solve our energy requirements. And I'm thinking about thorium, the possibility of thorium fuel cycle faces that enormous obstacle of getting new regulatory thing in place, even if it's technically feasible. So, and at the same time, there's no political will behind any of this, behind nuclear. And the Republicans are, funded by the Koch brothers, and the Democrats are kind of held hostage by environmentalists, and so who's going to push it? And so it's very frustrating for me to realize that we have solutions that we can deploy. And I don't have a question.
The United States, to a greater extent than a lot of countries, has a semi-decent process for figuring out which projects it wants to donate money to the R&D. And sometimes even after R&D, they donate money to. So in the United States, thorium is one of the Generation 4 projects that is being looked at. There, and in the world, it is, China is looking at thorium. India and Norway are both highly radioactive countries, definitely more radioactive in the area around Chernobyl and much of Fukushima. And have these huge thorium deposits, and so both of those countries are also looking at thorium technology. I avoid all Gen 4. I've been watching solar, and this technology looks like it's going to be promising, and it turns out not to work. And this technology is going to be promising, and it turns out not to work. Same for batteries. I've been watching all these technologies not work. I totally don't even pay attention to the Generation 4 technologies until a lot later in the process, which we're not at yet. So they are looking at thorium. Thorium has problems, and thorium has strengths. And I can send information, that's one of the, I can send information to what the World Nuclear Association says about both of those.
Hi,
Who's got the mic?
I heard you maybe an implication that the directors of national laboratories have endorsed increased nuclear power, and along with that, I think I understood a statement that implied they were unbiased or untouched by commercial interests. Are you aware that the national laboratories are now managed by consortiums that include engineering firms and other outside interests that do have ties?
I have hearing problem. Can you repeat the question?
The national labs that you cited, the directors were in support of nuclear power, are currently managed by consortiums of private companies along with government agencies. The Lawrence Livermore Lab, as an example, is no longer managed by UC exclusively.
They are government managed. Okay, so all the national labs are Department of Energy managed. There will be money that comes in from industry. For example, next generation biofuels using trees, lignin, and not just corn. And so that you're getting a lot of funding from that. But the nuclear industry is not, any time the nuclear labs work on nuclear power, that comes from Department of Energy. That's a Department of Energy decision, not a commercial decision, and it's going to be research.
So, at the risk of sounding foolish, if the spent fuel is so hot that they have to they have to cool it with more water, why don't they just use that to boil more water to turn more turbines? And the other question is, are all of these massive, amounts of spending that you're citing that would be necessary to fulfill whatever thing, are those? Well, that's my question. So I'm asking them to answer it. So all of this massive amounts of spending to have basically zero impact on the environment. What is the net cost of all of that, and how would that affect the price? Baking into the price of, cost per watt or cost per megawatt or whatever. All of those things. How would that take into your models, your economic models?
Okay, just because you have hot water doesn't mean it's sufficient to actually schlep it out and use it for a turbine. So same thing, you got methane leaving waste garbage dump. It's not always cost effective to use it, even though it's natural gas, you want to use it like a natural gas power plant. What would happen to the cost of U.S. electricity if we added a $41 a ton cost to greenhouse gas emissions? Is that the question?
All the super high costs of every little thing you mentioned.
We would not be adding for air pollution. If you just add for greenhouse gas emissions, it would increase the price of U.S. electricity. Right now it's half natural gas, so it would increase the price of U.S. electricity by about 2 cents, somewhere around 2 cents a kilowatt hour. That would go up. However, what it would do is it would encourage people to reconsider whether you really want to close that nuclear power plant because natural gas is so cheap. It would encourage companies that have to decide whether or not to build a nuclear power plant or a natural gas power plant, knowing that the price of natural gas is going to go up. It would encourage them to build nuclear. Because it isn't just the price it's going to be today, it's the price it's going to be in the future, and the price will go up. The cost of our emissions is going up. The cost to society of our emissions is going up.
So my question, it's right here, I got it, sorry. I think I've read a book called The Cubic Mile of Oil, which gives a global perspective on energy needs in the world. And the point, I think, is made that it's not enough, that it agrees that nuclear power is a good component of our energy needs, but it's not enough to replace CO2 emitting fuels with 20% by nuclear, because you still have 80% of the emissions coming out and a lot of CO2 emissions. So we need to replace a large portion, 80, 90%. The estimate that to replace our world energy needs with nuclear is bringing something like on the order of 1 new power plant online every week for the next 50 years. So that's a huge amount of nuclear power that we would need. And I think the conclusion or the recommendation is that it needs to be part of a larger global effort, including population control, reduced conservation, wind and solar, and numerous every other option we have available.
Yes, I said I was only talking about electricity, and in electricity, nuclear is only part of the solution.
So this has to be our last question. Any other questions you can direct right to Karen, okay? Sorry.
So your knock against solar and wind is they're not baseload, but we know we're going to need batteries for electric vehicles. Why don't we get on with massive production of that, improvement of that technology, recycling, and that will help address that need. And having said that, I'm not against nuclear, but I'd really like to see fusion get done. We can do it. Let's do an Apollo shot on fusion.
Fusion has, the role of, the expectations of fusion have improved. They've moved from 30 years in the future from when I was a child to 25 years in the future today. The renewables, and okay, so batteries are extremely expensive. They are incredibly energy intensive. People who buy lead acid batteries and go live off the grid, half the energy that battery will ever store is required to manufacture it. The more expensive, better batteries that are now being used, like in California, to store wind power, 20% of the energy that those batteries will ever store are required for manufacture. You know what kind of energy was used for the manufacture. You notice we do not manufacture batteries in California. There's a reason for that. We don't want the greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the ways we manipulate the data to look like there's many ways we manipulate the data to make it look like we're doing more impressively than we are. And one of them is we import somebody else's greenhouse gas, coal-produced batteries into California, and then there's zero greenhouse gas emissions to actually run. The something like 20% of the solar or wind kilowatt hours we put into the battery get lost in the charge-discharge cycle. And they're expensive. You can't be all that without being expensive. My friends who work at the National Lab on batteries and solar, and the economists who are looking at what they're hearing from everybody all say batteries will continue to be expensive for a very long time in the future. Nobody at any high level is expecting battery prices to come down. And energy costs are going to have to be a huge portion of that price reduction. There has to be a lot less energy used.
Okay, thank you, Karen.
Thank you for your questions. land of attention.
So if you want to ask Carrie some questions, come up and ask her right now.